Imagine, for just a moment, that you are walking through a quiet marketplace, somewhere very, very far from home. The air smells of warm spices and dust, and the sweet smoke of small cooking fires. The sun is low in the sky, casting long golden shadows between the tents and the wooden stalls. All around you, there are voices, soft voices, speaking in languages you have never heard before. Some of them sound like singing. Some of them sound like the wind moving through tall grass. And the people themselves, they come from places you can barely picture in your mind. From mountains in the far west, from deserts in the south, from cold, green forests far to the north. They have all travelled for many, many months to be here, in this small, dusty market, somewhere in the middle of a great continent. In the stalls around you, there are wonders, bolts of silk, soft and shining, the colour of sunset, small jars of saffron, glowing orange-red in the fading light, carved boxes made of dark wood, pieces of jade, smooth and cool to the touch, strings of pearls the colour of moonlight, tea leaves wrapped in paper, carpets folded thick and heavy, woven with patterns that seem almost alive. And the people who have brought all of these things, they have walked for months and months and sometimes years to bring them here. They have crossed deserts where the sand goes on forever. They have crossed mountains where the snow never melts. They have slept under skies so full of stars that the stars almost seemed closer than the ground beneath them. This is the world we are going to enter tonight, the world of the Silk Road, a long, slow, ancient road that did not really exist as a single road at all, but as a great web of paths and trails and quiet stops and small kindnesses that connected the eastern edge of the world to the western edge for more than 1,000 years. And tonight, you are going to travel that road slowly, gently, with nothing to do but listen and nowhere to be but right here. So, now turn your phone screen face down, follow me now to help the channel, and relax completely. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw soften, let your breath grow slow and easy, and let me take you gently onto the long road east. To understand what it was like to travel the Silk Road, you first have to understand what the Silk Road actually was. It was not, as I said a moment ago, a single road. There was no one path you could point to on a map and say, yes, this is the Silk Road. Instead, it was a great network, a web, of many, many strands of paths stretching across thousands of miles from the cities of eastern China all the way to the markets of the Mediterranean Sea. Some of these paths were old, even when people first began to call them the Silk Road. They had been used for centuries, maybe longer. People had been moving across the great heart of Asia for as long as there had been people there. Hunters, herders, wanderers, travellers. They walked from one valley to the next, from one oasis to the next, from one quiet camp to the next. And slowly, over many lifetimes, the paths they walked became known, became remembered, became real. And then, one day, people began to carry things along these paths, not just themselves, not just their food and their tents and their animals, but things, beautiful things, that they could trade for other beautiful things far away. The most famous of these things was silk, a soft, shining cloth made by the people of China, who had learned a wonderful secret. They had learned how to take the fine threads spun by tiny silkworms and weave those threads into a cloth so smooth, so light, so beautiful, that no one in the rest of the world had ever seen anything quite like it. For a long time, only the Chinese knew how to make silk, and so when traders began to carry small bundles of silk westward across the deserts and mountains, the people in the West would marvel at it. They had never felt a cloth like it. It was lighter than wool, smoother than linen, stronger than cotton. It seemed almost magical. It almost seemed like it had been made by gods rather than by ordinary people in faraway villages. And so silk became precious, very precious. People would pay great sums for even a small piece of it. Kings and queens wanted it. Wealthy people in distant cities wanted it. And so the traders kept carrying it westward year after year, generation after generation. And along with the silk they began to carry other things too: spices, tea, porcelain, paper, carved jade and ivory, strange medicines made from plants that only grew on certain mountains. And going the other way, from the west toward the east, came other treasures. Glass from the Mediterranean, clear and colored and beautiful, gold and silver, wool, horses, especially great strong horses from the lands north of Persia, carpets, spices that grew only in India and the islands beyond, strange new fruits like grapes and figs and pomegranates, and ideas too, ideas of all kinds, stories, religions, music, knowledge. The Silk Road was, in a way, the slow heartbeat of the ancient world. It connected places that, otherwise, would never have known of each other's existence. A merchant in a small town in Italy might wear a piece of silk that had been spun somewhere by a quiet old woman in a village in eastern China, a village so far away that in another lifetime no one in Italy would even have known such a place existed. And the old Chinese woman in her quiet village might one day taste a fig that had grown on a tree in the warm sunlight of Greece. And neither of them would ever meet. Neither of them would ever even know each other's names. But they were connected, somehow, by this long, slow road. That is the kind of magic the Silk Road had. A quiet magic, not the magic of dragons or of wizards, but the magic of small things, traveling great distances in the hands of patient people over many, many years.
Let us imagine now that we are starting our journey at the eastern end of the Silk Road. We are in an ancient city in China called Chang'an. It is one of the great cities of the world in those days, perhaps the greatest. It has wide stone streets and tall wooden towers, and beautiful gardens with small ponds and flowering trees. The walls of the city are very high and very strong, made of packed earth and stone, and they stretch for many miles around. Inside, there are temples, and palaces, and markets, and quiet neighborhoods where ordinary families live their ordinary lives. In the markets of Chang'an, you can find anything at all. There are merchants here from all over the Eastern world. There are people from the south of China with their dark hair and their soft accents. There are people from the steppes far to the north, tall and weathered, smelling of horses and wind. There are travelers from Korea and from Japan and from the kingdoms of Southeast Asia, and there are the foreign merchants too, the ones who have come from the west, from Persia and from Sogdiana and from places even further. They wear different clothes, they speak different languages, but they smile and they trade and they drink tea in the small tea houses and they tell stories. The marketplace is alive with sound, the voices of the traders calling out their wares, the clinking of small bells on the harnesses of camels, the clatter of cups being washed, the low murmur of conversation in a dozen languages at once, children laughing somewhere down a side street, a musician playing a soft tune on some kind of stringed instrument, the music drifting out from a tea-house window. The smells are rich and many. Cooking food, of course, hot oil, garlic, ginger, the sweet smell of incense burning at small shrines along the walls, the earthy smell of the camels and the donkeys, the sharp smell of leather, the dusty smell of grain, the cool, faint smell of fresh water in the public fountains. If you were a merchant here, preparing to travel west on the Silk Road, you would spend many days in this city, getting ready. You would go to the markets and buy your trade goods, bolts of silk, carefully wrapped to keep them from getting dirty, boxes of tea, pieces of porcelain padded with straw, small, precious things, wrapped in cloth and tucked into wooden chests. You would gather food for the journey, dried meats, hard breads, bags of grain for the animals, leather flasks for water, and you would prepare your animals. For most travelers on the Silk Road, the animal of choice was the camel. The Bactrian camel, with its two humps, was the great traveler of the inner Asian roads. It could carry heavy loads. It could go long distances without water. It could survive in places where horses and donkeys would die. It could walk through deep sand. It could climb rocky paths. It could endure the bitter cold of the high deserts at night, and the burning heat of the same deserts during the day. So before leaving, you would buy your camels or rent them. You would inspect them carefully, looking at their feet and their humps and their teeth, making sure they were healthy and strong. You would buy good rope and good saddlebags and good blankets. You would talk to other travelers who had come from the west, and you would ask them about the road. Where was the water good? Where were the bandits? Where could you find shelter? Where were the kindly people who would give a stranger a meal and a place to sleep? All of this took time, and there was no rush. The Silk Road moved slowly. The seasons mattered. You did not want to leave Chang'an in the wrong month. You did not want to be in the great deserts in the heat of summer. You did not want to be in the high mountains in the depths of winter. So you would plan, and you would wait, and eventually, when the weather was right, and your goods were ready, and your animals were strong, you would gather with other merchants into a caravan, and you would set out. A caravan was a small, slow, moving village. It was not just one or two travelers, it was many. Sometimes a few dozen people, sometimes 100 or more, merchants with their goods, servants and helpers who took care of the animals and cooked the food, guards who watched for trouble, sometimes monks or pilgrims who were traveling for religious reasons rather than for trade, sometimes ordinary people just trying to get from one city to another, who paid the merchants for the safety of traveling in a group. And there were the animals, many, many animals, long lines of camels, walking slowly, one behind the other, each one tied gently to the next. Their humps swayed as they walked. Small bells hung from their harnesses, making a soft, musical sound that you could hear from far away. Donkeys, too, sometimes, for carrying lighter loads, and horses, ridden by the leaders of the caravan and by the guards. The caravan moved at the pace of the camels, which was a slow pace, about the speed of a person walking comfortably, maybe 2 or 3 miles per hour, sometimes faster, on good roads, sometimes slower, in difficult country. The whole caravan would walk for several hours in the morning, then stop in the middle of the day, when the sun was hot, to rest. They would camp somewhere with shade and water if they could find it. They would eat. They would let the animals drink, and in the late afternoon they would set out again and walk for several more hours until the sun began to set. Then they would make their evening camp and cook their dinner and sleep. Day after day, this was the pattern: walk in the morning, rest in the afternoon, walk in the late afternoon, camp at night. The same simple rhythm, repeated again and again for weeks, for months, sometimes for years, if the journey was a very long one. You might think this would be difficult, and in some ways it was. The desert sun was hot, the mountain wind was cold, the food was often plain, the water was sometimes hard to find, but there was also a peace in it, a slowness, a simple, quiet way of living that, after a few weeks, became almost beautiful. The travelers in the caravan got to know each other very well. There was nothing to do, really, but talk and rest and watch the world go by. They would walk side by side or sit together at meals, and they would tell each other stories, stories of where they had come from, stories of their families far away, stories of other journeys they had made, stories of strange things they had seen in distant places. The merchants would talk about trade, about prices in different cities, about what was selling well that year and what was not, about the best routes, about the people you could trust, and the people you should be careful with. The young travelers, on their first journey, would listen carefully, trying to learn everything they could. The old travelers, who had made the trip many times, would smile and tell their stories patiently, as if they had all the time in the world, which, in a way, they did. The guards walked at the edges of the caravan, watching the horizon. They did not say much. They were quiet men, mostly. They had been hired for their strength and their watchfulness, not for their conversation, but they were a comforting presence. They meant that the caravan was safe, that they were being looked after. The servants took care of the everyday work, cooking, setting up tents, feeding the animals, carrying water. They worked from before dawn until after dark every day, but they too settled into the slow rhythm of the road, and they too became part of the small moving village. At night, when the camp was set up and the fires were burning low and the animals were quiet, the caravan felt almost like a family. People sat together, they ate together, they told stories, they laughed softly, and then, one by one, they would lie down in their blankets, and they would sleep beneath the stars. The stars, on the Silk Road, were extraordinary. Out in the open country, far from the lights of any city, the sky at night was so full of stars that you could hardly believe it. Travelers wrote in their journals about how beautiful the stars were, how bright, how many. They said it felt like the whole sky was full of soft fire. They said you could see things in the night sky that you would never see anywhere else. The river of stars that we now call the Milky Way, stretching from one horizon to the other, like a great soft road in the sky, running parallel almost to the road they were walking on the ground. After many days of traveling west from Chang'an, the caravan would come to the great desert. This was, perhaps, the most difficult part of the entire Silk Road. The Taklamakan Desert, in what is now the western part of China, a huge, harsh, beautiful, terrifying place. The name itself, in the local language, was said to mean something like, "You go in, but you do not come out." It was a desert of sand, endless sand, dunes that rose hundreds of feet high, like waves of a frozen sea. And in the summer, it could be very, very hot. So hot that the sand burned your hands if you touched it. So hot that the air shimmered, and the horizon seemed to dance and waver in the distance. Travelers did not cross straight through the middle of the desert. That would have been suicide. Instead, they followed paths around the edges of the desert. There were two main routes. One went along the northern edge. One went along the southern edge. Each route passed through a string of small oasis towns, places where, against all odds, water came up from the ground and trees grew and people lived. These oasis towns were like beads on a long string. Each one was a small green island in a sea of sand. As you approached one, after many days in the open desert, you would first see the green far in the distance, just a thin dark line where the dunes ended, and then slowly the green would grow. You would see trees, you would see fields, you would see, finally, the walls and the houses of the town itself. The towns had names that have survived through thousands of years: Dunhuang, Turpan, Kashgar, Khotan. Each one had its own character, its own people, its own history. Some of them were small, some of them were large, some of them were quiet. Some of them were busy and full of life, but they all had something wonderful in common. They all had water, and after many days in the desert, with nothing but sand and sky and silence, the sound of water in an oasis town, the soft sound of a stream, or the splashing of a fountain in a small market square, was the most beautiful sound in the world. The travelers would stop in these towns for several days, sometimes longer if the weather was bad, or if they needed to wait for other caravans, or if they simply needed to rest. They would unload their tired camels and let them drink, and let them eat fresh grass for the first time in many days. They would wash themselves in the cool water. They would buy fresh food from the local markets. They would sleep in real beds, in small rooms with thick walls that kept out the desert heat. They would talk to the local people and learn the local news and hear stories of other travelers who had passed through. Each oasis town had its own small market where the travelers could trade with the locals or rest from their journey. The local people were used to seeing travelers. They were friendly often. They knew the travelers brought news from distant places, and goods you could not buy locally, and stories. So the travelers were welcomed, they were fed, they were given a place to sleep. And in the cool evenings of these oasis towns, after the heat of the day had faded, the travelers would sit on the rooftops, or in the small courtyards of the inns where they were staying, and they would watch the sun set over the desert. The sand would turn pink, and then orange, and then deep, deep red. The sky would fill with the warm colors of evening. The wind would die down. The temperature would drop, and the air would become soft and gentle and cool. It was a kind of peace that, after the hardness of the desert, felt almost like a gift. In some of these towns you could find quiet little tea houses where you could sit on a low wooden bench and drink tea from a small clay cup and watch the world go by. The tea was hot and slightly bitter and slightly sweet. It tasted like green leaves and like sunshine and like distant hills. The merchant would sit there with his cup of tea and feel his tired body slowly relaxing. The aches of many days of riding would slowly fade. His mind would grow quiet. He would think perhaps of his family, far away in the east. He would think of the long road still ahead of him, far to the west. But he would not feel rushed. He would not feel worried. He would just sit and drink his tea and watch the slow evening fall over the small oasis town. And then, eventually, the time would come to leave. The caravan would gather again. The animals would be reloaded. The travelers would say goodbye to the local people and to the few who would not be continuing on with them. And they would set out once again into the desert, westward. After many oasis towns and many weeks of desert travel, the caravan would begin to see, far in the distance, the great mountains of Central Asia. The mountains were enormous, taller than anything most of the travelers had ever seen. The tops of the highest peaks were white with snow, even in the middle of summer. The slopes were rocky and steep and difficult, and the air, as you climbed higher, became thin. Travelers wrote about how, at the highest passes, they would feel out of breath even when they were standing still, how their hearts would beat fast, how their heads would feel light and strange. The mountain passes had names. Some were old and famous, and some were known only to the local people. The travelers would hire local guides, men who had grown up in the mountains, who knew the paths, who knew where the snow was deep and where it was thin, who knew where the streams could be crossed and where they could not. These guides were quiet, weather-beaten men, with faces lined like the rocks themselves. They walked at the front of the caravan, leading the way, and the travelers followed. The mountain travel was slow, even slower than the desert. The paths were narrow. Sometimes they followed the edges of cliffs, with great drops on one side. The camels could not always make it through the highest passes, and so sometimes the merchants had to switch to yaks, great shaggy mountain animals that could survive in the thin cold air and carry heavy loads up steep slopes, or to mules, or in some places to nothing at all, and they would have to carry their goods on their own backs, walking step by careful step along the icy paths. The cold in the high mountains was very different from anything the travelers had felt in the deserts below. It was a wet cold, a bone-deep cold, a cold that came from snow and from wind and from the thin air at high altitudes. The travelers would wrap themselves in many layers of wool and fur. They would tie cloth across their faces, leaving only their eyes uncovered. They would walk with their heads down into the wind, one slow step at a time. But the mountains were also beautiful, so beautiful. The travelers wrote about this too. They wrote about the high meadows, full of wildflowers in the summer, the clear streams running down from the snow above, the blue sky, deeper and brighter than any sky they had ever seen, the eagles soaring in slow circles far overhead, the great silence of the mountains, a silence so deep that sometimes the only sound you could hear was your own breath and your own heartbeat, and the soft crunch of snow under your boots. There were small monasteries sometimes, built into the sides of the mountains, quiet places where monks lived simple, peaceful lives, far from the troubles of the world. Travelers would stop at these monasteries when they could. They would be given food and shelter for the night. They would sleep in small, plain rooms, on simple beds, and they would wake before dawn to the soft sound of bells and to the gentle chanting of the monks at their morning prayers. There was something about these monasteries that stayed with the travelers long after they had moved on, a feeling of peace, a feeling of being held gently by something larger than themselves. The mountain crossing could take many weeks, sometimes more. The caravan would move slowly, step by step, up one valley, over one pass, down into the next valley, up the next ridge. The animals would grow thin, the travelers would grow tired, but there was nothing to do but keep going, one day at a time, one step at a time, and then eventually, after what felt like forever, they would reach the high pass, the very top, the place where they would cross from one side of the mountains to the other. They would stand there in the thin, cold air, with the wind whipping around them, and they would look out and see, spread far below them, the long, slow descent into the lands of the West, new valleys, new rivers, new cities, somewhere in the distance, and they would take a long, slow breath, and they would smile, perhaps, just a little, and they would begin the long, slow walk down.
On the other side of On the other side of the mountains, the travellers entered a new world. Here were the cities of Central and Western Asia, old, beautiful cities, with names that have echoed down through the centuries: Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Tashkent. These were great trading cities full of life. They had been built and rebuilt many times over many hundreds of years. They had domed buildings of blue and turquoise tile gleaming in the sun. They had wide markets and tall minarets and gardens full of fruit trees. They had cool fountains in shaded courtyards. They had great libraries and schools and quiet houses where wise men sat and discussed ideas. Samarkand especially was famous. Travellers wrote about it with a kind of awe. They said it was one of the most beautiful cities they had ever seen. They said the markets were full of every kind of good you could imagine. They said the people were kind. They said the gardens were like something out of a dream. When a caravan arrived in a city like Samarkand, there was a kind of quiet excitement among the travellers. After so many weeks in the desert and the mountains, after so many lonely camps under the stars, after so many simple meals of dried meat and hard bread, to arrive in a great city was a wonderful thing. There was hot food, there were soft beds, there were baths, there were markets where you could buy fresh fruit and sweet pastries and cups of cool drink. There were people to talk to. There were stories to hear. The travellers would stay in places called caravanserais. These were large inns, built specifically for travellers and their animals. They were usually built in a square shape, with a great open courtyard in the middle. Around the courtyard were rooms for the travellers, and stables for the animals, and storerooms for the goods. The walls were thick, and the gates were strong, and at night the gates were locked, so the travellers could sleep safely, knowing that their goods and their animals and they themselves were all protected. A good caravanserai was a wonderful place. The courtyard would be full of people, travellers from many different lands, Local merchants come to look at the new goods, servants going back and forth with food and water, travellers' children playing in the corners, old men sitting on benches, smoking pipes, watching everything with quiet eyes. There would be a large fountain in the middle often, where people could wash. There might be a few trees providing shade. There might be musicians playing soft music in the evenings. The travellers would stay for many days in these cities, sometimes for weeks. They would sell some of their goods. They would buy other goods to take with them when they continued on. They would rest. They would let their animals recover their strength. They would gather news of the road ahead, of what was happening in the lands further west. And in the cool evenings, in the courtyards of the caravanserais, the travellers from many different lands would sit together and share their stories. This was, perhaps, one of the most beautiful things about the Silk Road, the way it brought people together who would otherwise never have met. A merchant from China might find himself sitting next to a merchant from Persia who was sitting next to a pilgrim from India, who was sitting next to a wandering scholar from Greece. They would all be in the same courtyard, drinking the same tea, watching the same stars come out above them. And they would talk. They would tell their stories. They would share what they knew about the world. In this way, ideas travelled along the Silk Road just as goods did. Ideas about religion, ideas about medicine, ideas about astronomy and mathematics, ideas about food and music and art and stories. A poem that was first sung in a small village in eastern China might, 200 years later, be sung in a different language, in a small village in Spain. A way of healing a particular illness learned from the doctors of India might travel across the road and become known in the homes of Italy. A musical instrument invented somewhere in Persia might be carried by a traveller to China and become the basis for a whole new tradition of music there. The Silk Road was, in a real way, one of the great movers of human knowledge in all of history. After many days of travelling west from Chang'an, the caravan would come to the Great Desert. This was, perhaps, the most difficult part of the entire Silk Road. The Taklamakan Desert, in what is now the western part of China. A huge, harsh, beautiful, terrifying place. The name itself in the local language was said to mean something like, "You go in but you do not come out." It was a desert of sand, endless sand, dunes that rose hundreds of feet high like waves of a frozen sea, and in the summer it could be very, very hot, so hot that the sand burned your hands if you touched it, so hot that the air shimmered and the horizon seemed to dance and waver in the distance. Travellers did not cross straight through the middle of the desert. That would have been suicide. Instead, they followed paths around the edges of the desert. There were two main routes. One went along the northern edge. One went along the southern edge. Each route passed through a string of small oasis towns, places where, against all odds, water came up from the ground and trees grew and people lived. These oasis towns were like beads on a long string. Each one was a small green island in a sea of sand. As you approached one after many days in the open desert, you would first see the green far in the distance, just a thin, dark line where the dunes ended, and then, slowly, the green would grow. You would see trees, you would see fields, you would see, finally, the walls and the houses of the town itself. The towns had names that have survived through thousands of years: Dunhuang, Turpan, Kashgar, Khotan. Each one had its own character, its own people, its own history. Some of them were small, some of them were large, some of them were quiet, some of them were busy and full of life. But they all had something wonderful in common. They all had water, and after many days in the desert with nothing but sand and sky and silence, the sound of water in an oasis town, the soft sound of a stream, or the splashing of a fountain in a small market square, was the most beautiful sound in the world. The travellers would stop in these towns for several days, sometimes longer if the weather was bad, or if they needed to wait for other caravans, or if they simply needed to rest. They would unload their tired camels and let them drink and let them eat fresh grass for the first time in many days. They would wash themselves in the cool water. They would buy fresh food from the local markets. They would sleep in real beds in small rooms with thick walls that kept out the desert heat. They would talk to the local people and learn the local news and hear stories of other travellers who had passed through. Each oasis town had its own small market where the travellers could trade with the locals or rest from their journey. The local people were used to seeing travellers. They were friendly, often. They knew the travellers brought news from distant places and goods you could not buy locally and stories. So the travellers were welcomed. They were fed. They were given a place to sleep. And in the cool evenings of these oasis towns, after the heat of the day had faded, the travellers would sit on the rooftops or in the small courtyards of the inns where they were staying, and they would watch the sun set over the desert. The sand would turn pink, and then orange, and then deep, deep red. The sky would fill with the warm colours of evening, the wind would die down, the temperature would drop, and the air would become soft and gentle and cool. It was a kind of peace that, after the hardness of the desert, felt almost like a gift. In some of these towns you could find quiet little tea houses where you could sit on a low wooden bench and drink tea from a small clay cup and watch the world go by. The tea was hot and slightly bitter and slightly sweet. It tasted like green leaves and like sunshine and like distant hills. The merchant would sit there with his cup of tea and feel his tired body slowly relaxing. The aches of many days of riding would slowly fade. His mind would grow quiet. He would think, perhaps, of his family far away in the east. He would think of the long road still ahead of him, far to the west. But he would not feel rushed. He would not feel worried. He would just sit and drink his tea and watch the slow evening fall over the small oasis town. And then, eventually, the time would come to leave. The caravan would gather again, the animals would be reloaded, the travellers would say goodbye to the local people and to the few who would not be continuing on with them, and they would set out once again into the desert, westward. Now, listener, let us slow down a little, and let me tell you about the quiet hours of the Silk Road journey, the hours that the merchants and the travellers remembered, perhaps, more deeply than any other. It is the middle of the day, in the open country between two cities. The caravan has stopped to rest through the heat. The animals are unloaded and standing quietly in the shade of a few small trees, or under a low rocky cliff. The travellers have spread out their blankets on the ground. Some are sleeping, some are sitting, eating a simple meal of bread and dried fruit. Some are just lying on their backs, looking up at the sky. The sky is very blue. There are a few small white clouds drifting slowly, slowly from one horizon to the other. The air is warm and dry and still. There is the soft, soft sound of the wind moving through the grass, the occasional low grunt of one of the camels, the distant call of a bird somewhere far away, and nothing else. No other sound, no human voices raised in argument or in laughter, no machines, of course, no cars or trains or planes, just the soft, slow sounds of the land itself and of the people and animals resting in it. Time in moments like these seemed to slow down almost to a stop. The travellers wrote about this feeling sometimes in their journals. They wrote about how, after weeks on the road, they began to lose their sense of urgency. They began to lose their sense of being in a hurry. The world moved at the pace of the caravan, and the caravan moved at the pace of the camels, and the camels moved at the pace of patient, slow walking. And so the travellers themselves began to move at this same slow, patient pace, inside their own minds, inside their own bodies. Their breathing became slower. Their thoughts became quieter. They began to notice things that they had never noticed before. The exact way the light fell on a particular hill, the exact colour of a flower they had passed without seeing on 100 other days, the way the shadow of a single bird moved across the ground, the smell of dust after a brief rain, the taste of fresh water from a clean spring. This was perhaps the gift of the Silk Road, not the goods that were carried, not the trade, not even the ideas that were exchanged, but the gift of a slower way of moving through the world, a way that allowed travellers to feel deeply what it was like to simply be alive, to simply be in their bodies, to simply walk and rest and walk and rest and watch the world. In the late afternoon, when the heat began to fade, the caravan would gather again. The animals would be reloaded, the blankets would be folded, the travellers would mount up or take their walking sticks in hand, and they would set out again. They would walk for a few more hours until the sun began to set, and then they would stop and make their evening camp. The evening camp was a beautiful thing. The travellers would unsaddle the animals and tie them in a long line where they could rest and graze. They would gather wood, if there was any to be found, and build a small fire. They would set up their tents low and round and made of thick wool. They would unpack the food for the evening meal. The cooks would begin to prepare dinner. A simple stew, perhaps, with rice and dried meat and a few vegetables, maybe some flat bread, baked in a pan over the fire, maybe some tea, brewed strong and hot in a kettle. The smell of the cooking food would drift out across the camp. The travellers would gather around, sitting on the ground in small groups, talking quietly. The fire would crackle and pop. The smoke would rise straight up into the still evening air. The sky would turn from blue to gold to pink to deep, deep purple. And then, slowly, the first stars would appear. Dinner would be eaten slowly, without rushing. Conversations would be soft. The travellers would smile at each other across the fire. They would share bread. They would pass the kettle of tea. They would ask each other small, friendly questions. They would tell small, friendly stories. And then, when dinner was over and the bowls had been cleaned and the tea had been finished, the travellers would slowly settle down for the night. Some would lie inside the tents. Some would lie outside, wrapped in their blankets, on the open ground, beneath the stars. The fire would burn low, the camp would grow quiet, the animals would be still, except for the occasional soft sound of one of them shifting its weight, or letting out a low breath in its sleep. And the stars would come out slowly, slowly, in their thousands, and then their tens of thousands, and then more than anyone could ever count. The whole sky would fill with them. The Milky Way would stretch across the heavens like a long, soft river of light, and the travellers would lie on their backs, and they would look up at the stars, and they would feel very small and very peaceful and very far from home. And one by one they would close their eyes, and one by one they would drift off to sleep. Let me tell you now more about the slow rhythm of the Silk Road, about what it was like day after day to simply be on this long, long journey. The mornings began early. Before the sun came up, the travellers would wake to the soft sounds of the camp coming alive, the cooks building up the fire, the animal handlers beginning to prepare the camels, the smell of tea brewing in a great kettle, the faint grey light of dawn just beginning to glow on the eastern horizon. The travellers would rise from their blankets slowly. They would stretch their stiff bodies. They would pull on their boots. They would wash their faces, perhaps, in cold water from a small basin. They would walk out from their tents into the cool morning air, and they would breathe deeply, looking around at the camp, at the slowly waking world. Breakfast was simple. A piece of flat bread, a handful of dried fruit, a small bowl of something warm, a kind of porridge perhaps, or a thin soup, a cup of hot tea. The travellers ate in small groups, talking quietly, getting ready for the day's walk. By the time the sun rose, the camp was almost packed up. The tents were folded, the animals were loaded, the travellers were mounted, or standing ready. The leader of the caravan would give a quiet signal, and the long line of camels would begin to move, one behind the other, out across the open land. The bells on their harnesses would begin their soft, soft music, and another day on the Silk Road would begin. The morning hours were the easiest of the day, the air was cool, the light was soft, the travellers were rested, the animals were strong, the caravan would move along at a steady pace, mile after mile, hour after hour. Sometimes the road would pass through open grasslands, sometimes through low, rolling hills, sometimes along the edges of dry riverbeds, sometimes through small villages where the local people would come out to watch them pass, and the children would run alongside for a little while, laughing and waving. Around the middle of the morning, the caravan might stop for a short rest. The travellers would dismount. They would drink a little water. They would adjust the loads on the animals if anything had shifted. They would talk for a few minutes and stretch their legs, and then they would mount up and continue on. By midday the sun was usually high and hot. This was when the caravan would stop for the long rest of the afternoon. They would find a good place, somewhere with shade, if possible, and water. They would unload the animals. They would set up small tents, or simply spread out blankets in the shade. They would eat a midday meal, and then they would rest through the hottest part of the day. The afternoon rest was a quiet, peaceful time. The travellers would sleep or read, or sit and talk, or simply lie still and watch the clouds drift by. The world around them would seem to slow almost to a stop. The animals would stand very still in the shade, half asleep, their long-lashed eyes half closed. The wind, if there was any, would move very gently through the grass. The sounds of the camp would soften and grow far apart. This was the part of the day that, for many travellers, was the most peaceful. Not the morning, with its energy and freshness, not the evening with its warmth and its meals, but the long, slow afternoon, when there was nothing to do and nowhere to be, and time itself seemed to be resting along with everyone else. In the late afternoon, when the heat began to fade, the caravan would prepare to move again. They would pack up, they would reload the animals, they would set out and walk for several more hours. The light would soften and turn golden. The shadows would grow long, the world would become beautiful in a way that only the late afternoon can be. And then, as the sun began to set, they would stop again and make camp, and the evening would come, and the stars would come out, and the slow rhythm of another day on the Silk Road would come to its quiet, gentle end. This was the pattern, day after day, week after week, month after month, the same simple, slow rhythm. Walk in the morning, rest in the afternoon, walk in the evening, sleep at night, wake, and do it all again. Many travellers, when they wrote about their journeys on the Silk Road, said something interesting. They said that after a few months on the road, something began to change inside them. At first, they had been worried about the dangers of the road, worried about whether they would make it safely to their destination, worried about money and about time, and about all the small problems of their lives back home. Their minds, in those first weeks, had been full of these worries. Their bodies had been tense, their sleep had been fitful. But after a while, after enough days of walking and resting and walking again, after enough nights of sleeping under the stars, with nothing between them and the great open sky, after enough simple meals and simple conversations and simple, quiet hours, something inside them began to soften. The worries did not go away exactly, but they began to feel less heavy, less urgent. The travellers began to notice that no matter what they worried about, the sun still rose every morning. The camels still walked their slow, patient walk. The wind still moved through the grass. The road, slowly, gently, kept unfolding ahead of them, and life kept happening in its own quiet way, whether they worried about it or not. So they began slowly to let go. Just a little, just enough. They began to enjoy their meals more, even though the meals were simple. They began to enjoy their conversations more, even though they were ordinary conversations. They began to enjoy the silence when there was silence. They began to enjoy the feeling of their own bodies, walking, breathing, alive in the open air. And they began to notice that they were sleeping better. Their dreams on the Silk Road were often quiet, gentle dreams. Dreams of home sometimes, dreams of childhood, dreams of small, peaceful places. They would wake in the morning feeling rested in a way they had not felt for many years. They began to notice that their bodies felt better too. The walking was good for them. The fresh air was good for them. The simple food was good for them. They felt stronger, somehow, even though the journey was hard. They felt clearer in their minds. They felt more themselves. And so, slowly, the long journey began to feel like a kind of healing. Even though it had not been planned that way, even though they had simply been trying to get from one place to another, to do their trade, to make their living. The road itself, in its long slowness, had begun to do something to them, to smooth them out, to soften their edges, to bring them in some quiet way closer to their own true selves. This was perhaps the deepest gift of the Silk Road, not the silk, not the spices, not even the friendships, but the slow, patient teaching of the road itself. Imagine now, listener, that you have been on this journey for a very long time. You have walked through cities and through deserts and through mountains. You have slept under more stars than you can count. You have shared meals with people from many different lands. You have learned to walk slowly, to rest when it was time to rest, to move when it was time to move, to accept the long, quiet rhythm of the road. And now, this evening, the caravan has stopped in a peaceful place, a small valley with a stream running gently through it. There are a few old trees, with soft grass growing beneath them. There are some flat stones, warm from the day's sun. The animals are resting nearby. The fire has been built. The evening meal has been eaten. The dishes have been washed. And now the travellers are settling down for the night. You are lying on your blanket on the soft grass beneath one of the old trees. You can see the sky through the branches. The sky is deep blue, fading slowly toward dark. A few stars are already out, very faint, very gentle. The wind has died down to almost nothing. The air is cool but not cold. It smells of grass and of wood smoke and of the clean water of the stream. The other travellers around you are settling down too. Some have already gone to sleep. You can hear their slow, even breathing. Some are sitting near the fire, talking softly, in low voices that you can barely hear, but that sound friendly and warm. The animals in their long line are quiet. One of the camels lets out a slow, deep breath. A little ways off, the stream makes its soft, soft sound, running gently over the stones. You are tired. A good kind of tired, the kind of tired that comes from a day of honest walking in the open air. Your body feels heavy and warm. Your muscles, slowly, are letting go of the day's effort. You can feel them softening, one at a time. Your shoulders, your back, your legs, your arms, your hands. The fire near the middle of the camp is burning low. Just a few small flames, a few glowing embers. The light is soft. It flickers very gently on the leaves of the tree above you. It flickers on the faces of the few people still sitting near it. The smoke rises straight up in a thin, thin line. The stars above you are getting brighter. More of them are appearing now. 1, 2, 5, 10, 20. So many. The sky is becoming a great soft sea of stars, deep and quiet and endless. Your eyes feel heavy. Your eyelids feel heavy. The world around you is becoming softer, slower. The conversations near the fire are growing fewer. The fire itself is getting smaller. The whole camp is settling slowly into the long quiet of the night. You take a slow breath in and a slow breath out, and another slow breath in and another slow breath out. You feel the cool air entering your body and warming and leaving again. You feel your chest rising and falling. You feel your heart beating slow and steady deep inside you. The road today is over. There is no more walking until the morning. There is no more work until the morning. There is nothing for you to do now except rest, except sleep, except let the long quiet of the night carry you gently into dreams. And tomorrow, when the morning comes, the caravan will rise again. The fires will be built up, the animals will be loaded, the road will go on. There will be more cities, more mountains, more deserts, more stars. The journey will continue as it has continued for many months, and as it will continue for many more. But that is tomorrow. Right now, there is only this soft grass, this warm blanket, this quiet camp, this sky full of stars. The fire is low, the stars are bright, the wind is gentle, the water is soft. You can feel your body slowly becoming heavier. You can feel your mind slowly becoming quieter. The thoughts that used to come and go quickly and busily are coming more slowly now. Some of them are not even words. They are images. They are colors. They are pieces of memory, drifting like clouds. You see in your mind the long line of camels walking across an open plain. You see the shimmer of a small stream deep in a desert. You see the bright tile of a great dome, somewhere in a city far away. You see the snow on the high mountains, white and clean and quiet. You see a small fire in a courtyard with travellers sitting around it, telling stories you cannot quite hear. And then even those images begin to fade. They become softer, slower. They drift away. You are very heavy now, very still, very, very calm. The sounds of the camp are still there, the fire very faint, the breathing of the others, the soft sound of the stream, the wind in the leaves. But they are far away now. They are far, far away. They are just a soft, gentle background, a soft, gentle blanket of sound all around you. Sleep is coming slowly, slowly, like a quiet wind. Let it come. Let your eyes stay closed. Let your body stay heavy. Let your breathing stay slow and easy. You are safe. You are warm. You are surrounded by good, quiet companions who will watch over you while you sleep. The animals will not wander away. The fire will not go out. The stars will keep turning, slow and patient, across the great quiet sky. And tomorrow, when the soft light of dawn begins to glow on the eastern horizon, and the cooks begin to build up the fire, and the animals begin to stir, you will wake, and you will rise, and the long road will go on. But not yet. For now, there is only the night. For now, there is only this small, quiet camp in a small, quiet valley, somewhere along a long, long road. For now, there is only the soft sound of the stream and the soft breathing of the wind and the soft, quiet weight of your own body, settling deeper and deeper and deeper into rest. The fire is low, the stars are out, the wind is gentle, the night is wide, the night is soft, the night is kind. Breathe in slowly and breathe out slowly. Breathe in and breathe out Somewhere very far away, a long line of camels is walking along a quiet road with their soft bells ringing in the still evening air and their patient feet making the same slow steps they have made for thousands of years. Somewhere very far away, a small fire is burning low in a stone courtyard, and a few quiet travellers are leaning back against the warm walls, and the smoke is rising into a sky full of stars. Somewhere, very far away, the long road is going on, as it has always gone on, gentle and patient and slow. And here, where you are, the night is settling all around you, soft as wool, gentle as breath. Sleep well, traveller, sleep well, sleep.